The blue-tinted deluge hammered against the luxury suite, turning the room into a watery cage where the rest of Seoul ceased to exist. Naira stood steady, her white t-shirt soaked to his second skin, clinging to her as she felt the heat radiating off him. Suk, the man the entire syndicate feared, had his forehead pressed to hers, his powerful, tattooed frame vibrating with a pained, silent surrender. "Tell me to walk away, Naira," he whispered, his voice a rough fracture. "Before I ruin you like I ruin everything else. If you're ready to see if Naira survives the world of the most dangerous man in Korea, hit that subscribe button right now. Comment risk if you'd stay, and smash that like button because this story is about to get intense. You don't want to miss what happens next." She should have run. God, she should have. 17 women before her had seen the manhood of the boss and fled in terror. But Naira wasn't just any woman. She was his anchor. That was the arrangement. She would provide the emotional stability he needed to keep his throne, and in return, he would be her shield. But as the cold, lethal weight of the silver handgun in his waistband pressed against her hip, Naira realized the cleansing water of this shower couldn't wash away the blood already on his hands, or the test he was about to put her through. 3 months before the blue-toned silence of the luxury shower, there was the neon-soaked chaos of a rain-slicked alleyway in Seoul. It wasn't liquid silk back then. It was freezing rain and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and blood. Naira had been taking a shortcut behind a private lounge, her mind focused on the exhaustion of a double shift, when she stepped directly into the path of a nightmare. A black sedan had pinned a man against the damp brickwork. Surrounding him were shadows and tailored suits, men who moved with a lethal, practiced precision that signaled they weren't mere street thugs. In the center of the circle stood the boss. Suk didn't have his eyes closed in pained surrender then. They were cold, obsidian shards, fixed on the man gasping for air at his feet. One of Suk's hands was wrapped around the man's throat, the intricate black ink on his knuckles appearing to writhe under the flickering orange streetlights. When the sound of Naira's footstep on a stray metal grate echoed through the alley, the few other witnesses, a delivery driver and 2 late-night revelers, scattered like shadows at dawn. They knew the unspoken rule of the city. You do not look at the king of the underworld when he is working. You run, and you keep running until your lungs burn. But Naira stayed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, yet her legs remained rooted to the wet asphalt. Suk dropped the man and turned. He moved with the slow, predatory grace of a wolf that knew the forest belonged to him. His men stepped forward to remove the nuisance, but Suk raised a tattooed hand, stopping them in their tracks. He walked toward her until the scent of expensive cologne and cold rain filled her lungs. He expected her to tremble. He expected her to beg. He expected the same terrified flight he had seen in every other woman who had ever glimpsed the monster behind his suit. Instead, Naira tilted her chin up. She didn't look at the silver handgun tucked into his waistband or the blood staining his cuff. She looked directly into the hollow, exhausted darkness of his eyes. She didn't blink. In that moment of silent, reckless defiance, the monster met the anchor. Suk froze, his breath hitching as he saw something he hadn't encountered in years, a person who wasn't afraid of him. He didn't see a victim, he saw a mirror. The expected knock never came. Instead, Naira found Suk sitting in the dim light of her small apartment, a silhouette of sharp angles and expensive fabric that felt entirely too large for the room. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a thin file, her life summarized in a few pages of cold data. 17 women, he began, his voice like the low hum of a distant engine. That is how many have stood where you stood in that alley. Some screamed. Most ran. All of them eventually broke. He looked up, his obsidian eyes scanning her face for a flicker of the terror he was used to harvesting. Naira didn't give it to him. She set her keys on the counter, the metal clinking against the cheap laminate. "And you're here to see if I'll break too?" "No," he said, standing slowly. He moved toward her, stopping just at the edge of her personal space. The air between them grew thick, charged with the same electric tension of the rain-soaked night they met. The syndicate sees me as a liability. They see a man who has lost his center, a beast with no leash. My rivals smell blood because they believe my intensity, what they call my manhood, has finally made me volatile. They think I have no one to return home to, no one to ground the darkness they fear will eventually consume me. He paced the small space, his tattooed neck flashing under the yellow glow of her overhead bulb. I don't need a lover, Naira. I need an anchor. Someone whose eyes don't shatter when they look at me. Someone whose composure can convince the world that I am a man who can be governed. An arrangement, she whispered. It wasn't a question. A contract, he corrected. You walk by my side. You sit at my table, and you look at me exactly the way you did in that alley. In return, your debts vanish. You will have a life of absolute stability, provided you can handle the instability of mine. Naira looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the exhaustion he tried to hide behind the violence. She was a woman who prided herself on her strength, but this was a leap into a dangerous abyss. She knew her fearlessness was a gamble, yet the thought of being the only one to stay was a siren song she couldn't ignore. What happens if I can't anchor you? She asked. Suk leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. Then we both drown. The grand ballroom of the Latte Hotel didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a gladiator pit lined with gold leaf and crystal. Naira walked in a gown of deep emerald, the silk whispering against her legs, but her true armor was the steady, unwavering rhythm of her heart. Beside her, Suk was a monolith in charcoal wool. His hand was a heavy, possessive weight at the small of her back, his fingers grazing the skin just above the fabric, a constant reminder of the tether between them. The air in the room changed the moment they crossed the threshold. The low hum of elite conversation died, replaced by a sharp, collective intake of breath that rippled through the crowd. The vultures, the lieutenants, the bored socialites, and the power-hungry rivals of the soul underworld watched them with predatory curiosity. They had all heard the whispers of the woman who hadn't run. They were waiting for the crack in the porcelain, the moment she realized she was standing next to a live wire. So, this is the one, a voice rasped, cutting through the tension. It was Elder Min, a man whose smile never reached his milky, calculating eyes. He stepped into their path, a glass of amber liquid held loosely in his hand. He looked Naira up and down, his gaze lingering with a deliberate, insulting slowness. She has a certain resilience. But tell me, girl, do you know what happens to things that refuse to bend? They shatter. Suk has a habit of breaking his toys. Suk's jaw tightened, his frame coiling with a sudden, lethal energy. The monster was rising to the surface, ready to tear the disrespect from the old man's throat. But Naira didn't wait for his protection. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took a half step forward, shortening the distance until she was staring directly into Min's face, her eyes wide and unblinking. I've spent my life navigating storms much darker than this room. Elder, she said, her voice a calm, low melody that carried across the silent circle. A little wind doesn't frighten me. And as for shattering, perhaps you should worry about the floor beneath you before you concern yourself with my foundations. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. The silence stretched until Min finally gave a stiff, begrudging nod and stepped aside, the vulture's wings clipped by her sheer composure. As they moved toward the center of the room, Suk leaned down, his lips ghosting against her ear. You were supposed to be the mask, Naira, he murmured, a rare trace of genuine wonder filtering through his voice. But I think you might be the blade. For the first time, the syndicate didn't see a liability. They saw a boss who had finally found an anchor made of the same iron as his throne. The transition from the neon-lit ballroom to the hushed, mountainside estate of Madame Kong felt like stepping out of a storm and into a tomb. The air here was thick with the scent of sandalwood and old secrets, a silence so heavy it made Naira's ears ring. Suk remained in the courtyard, a dark silhouette against the white stone, leaving Naira to face the woman who had built the throne he now occupied. Madame Kong sat behind a low tea table, her silk robes flowing around her like a pool of ink. Her face was a map of ruthless survival, eyes sharp enough to cut through the composure Naira had worn so well. For a long moment, the only sound was the delicate pour of tea into ceramic cups. He calls you his anchor, Madame Kong said, her voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of decades. A poetic sentiment for a man who is essentially a sinking ship. Naira didn't reach for the tea. She kept her back straight, her gaze fixed on the older woman. He says I am the only one who hasn't run. Madame Kong let out a short, mirthless laugh. 17. That is the number BM Suk carries. 17 women who thought they were strong enough to love a hurricane. Some were more beautiful than you, some were more cunning, and a few were just as brave. But they all broke, Naira. Not because of his enemies, and not because of his fists. She leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening in the folds of her face. They broke against his intensity. There is a gravity to BM Suk, a manhood that is less about strength and more about a bottomless, aching need for a peace he can never find. He is a man who loves with the same violence he uses to kill. He doesn't just want a partner, he wants to be consumed. He will pull you into the deepest parts of his soul, and when you realize there is no oxygen left for you, you will try to swim for the surface. That is when the breaking happens. Naira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She thought of the way BM Suk had looked at her in the alley, not with malice, but with a desperate, silent plea. I am not them, Naira said, her voice steady despite the weight of the warning. They all said that, Madame Kong whispered, pushing a small, weathered jade charm across the table. Just remember, an anchor that stays down too long eventually becomes part of the wreckage. You think you are saving him, but have you asked yourself who is going to save you? The descent from the mountain was a blur of gray mist and the rhythmic slap of wipers against the windshield. Inside the car, the silence was suffocating, charged with the ghosts of the 17 women Madame Kong had invoked. When the engine finally cut out in the driveway of BM Suk's private residence, the rain intensified, drumming a frantic code against the roof. BM Suk didn't move to get out. He sat with his hands gripped white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his head bowed. The neon glow from a distant security light bled a cold, blue tint across his features, highlighting the deep lines of weariness that the syndicate never got to see. She told you I was a monster, he said, his voice barely a tremor, a rough fracture of the man the world feared. She told me you were a hurricane, Naira replied softly, her voice steady in the cramped space. He turned to her then, and for the first time, the obsidian shards in his eyes were replaced by something raw and shattered. He stepped out into the downpour, not caring for the expensive wool of his suit or the biting cold. Naira followed him into the blue-toned dark. The rain lashed at them, soaking her simple white t-shirt until it clung to her skin, but she didn't retreat. He stopped near the edge of the stone terrace, his powerful shoulders slumped as if the very air had turned to lead. I am exhausted, Naira, he whispered, the words nearly lost to the wind. The blood, the loyalty tests, the constant looking over my shoulder. It's a cage. They see the power, but I only feel the weight. Every morning I wake up and wonder if today is the day I finally lose the man to the beast. He reached out, his tattooed hand trembling as he touched her cheek. They all ran because they saw the monster. But you look at me like I'm still human. Naira stepped into his space, closing the gap. She reached up, placing her hand flat over his heart, asserting a quiet, emotional control that stilled his shaking frame. Under her palm, his heart was a thudding, frantic thing, but as her eyes remained wide and fixed on his, the rhythm began to slow. In that rain-slicked world, the violence of his life felt like a distant fever dream. For the first time, BM Suk leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes drifting shut in a moment of pained surrender. He wasn't the boss in that moment. He was a man finding his first breath of oxygen in years. Naira didn't just anchor him. She became the only place where the storm didn't reach. The peace of the rain was a lie, a fragile glass ornament that shattered the moment BM Suk stepped back into the sterile, fluorescent glare of his world. In the quiet hours of the night, while Naira slept with the steady, rhythmic breathing of a woman who had finally found her place, BM Suk sat in his study, the blue light of a dozen surveillance monitors reflecting in his obsidian eyes. The monster within him didn't know how to live in the silence. It only knew how to survive in the siege. The paranoia began as a cold itch at the base of his skull. He had seen the face of a god in the rain, but the devil in his blood wouldn't let him believe it was real. She will leave, the voice whispered. They all did. He decided he wouldn't wait for the heartbreak to surprise him. If she was going to break, he would be the one to apply the pressure. The experiment was surgical. It started with the feeling of being watched, not by him, but by shadows he orchestrated. A black SUV with tinted windows began to tail Naira's bus, never pulling away, always lingering just long enough to be a threat. Then came the anonymous envelopes left on her doorstep, grainy photos of her in the alleyway, her face circled in red ink. He watched her through hidden cameras as she opened them, his breath hitching, waiting for the familiar scent of fear, the frantic packing of bags, the phone call to the police that would prove she was just like the 17 who came before her. But Naira didn't pack. She didn't cry. She sat at her kitchen table, the terrifying photos spread out before her like a deck of cards, and she simply looked at them with that same unblinking, wide-eyed composure. She was observant enough to feel the trap closing in, yet fearless enough to walk through it. BM Suk watched her from the shadows of his office, his tattooed hand gripping a glass of whiskey so hard it threatened to crack. He was the one orchestrating the terror, the one pulling the strings of the scare tactics. Yet as he saw her refuse to flinch, his heart ached with a toxic mixture of admiration and deepening madness. He was subjecting her to the very danger he had promised to protect her from, all to see if she would stay. He told himself it was a loyalty test, but in the dark, he knew the truth. He was trying to ruin the only thing that had ever made him feel human, just to prove he was right about being a monster. The rooftop bar was bathed in a deep, sapphire neon that turned the falling sleet into shards of floating glass. They were supposed to be negotiating territory, but the air was thick with something far more volatile than business. Opposite them sat Park, a rival whose ambition was as loud as the gold chains around his neck. He didn't look at BM Suk. He looked at Naira, his eyes tracing the line of her throat with a hunger meant to provoke. "You've traded your fangs for a leash, BM Suk." Park sneered, leaning forward until the scent of bitter tobacco invaded their space. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing Naira's hand with deliberate disrespect. "Tell me, does she know she's just the latest in a long line of ghosts? Or does she think her skin is thick enough to stop the bullets meant for you?" Naira didn't pull her hand away. She met Park's gaze with a terrifying stillness, her eyes wide and unblinking, even as the temperature at the table plummeted. But the BM Suk who had whispered of exhaustion and peace in the rain was gone. In a movement too fast for the eye to track, the monster reclaimed its throne. BM Suk didn't use the handgun in his waistband. He used the raw, tectonic fury of his own body. He vaulted over the table, his tattooed arm a blur of ink as he pinned Park against the ledge of the rooftop, 20 stories above the soul traffic. The sound of bone meeting granite echoed over the city's hum. It wasn't a clean, cinematic fight. It was a brutal, systematic dismantling. BM Suk's face was a mask of cold, unholy intensity, the terrifying manhood that had sent 17 women screaming into the night. When he finally stepped back, his knuckles were split, and his breath came in jagged, predatory lunges. Park was a heap of groans and broken pride. BM Suk turned to Naira, his eyes still dark with the high of the hunt. He expected to see the back of her emerald gown as she fled toward the elevator. Instead, she stepped into the circle of his violence. She reached out, her fingers steady as she wiped a spray of blood from his cheek. She didn't look at the ruin he had made of the man at his feet. She looked into the heart of the beast. For a heartbeat, the air was static. Then he pulled her into a kiss that tasted of iron and salt, a lethal, desperate collision. The mask hadn't just slipped. It had burned away, leaving her with the raw, terrifying truth of the man she was anchoring. The water fell like heavy rain, a blue-tinted deluge that blurred the edges of the luxury suite until the world outside the glass walls ceased to exist. In the steam and the silence, the cleansing was supposed to be complete. BM Suk's forehead pressed against Naira's, his eyes squeezed shut in a pained surrender that felt like the end of a war. His powerful, tattooed frame trembled against her, the ink on his skin appearing to bleed into the shadows under the sapphire light. "They all ran, Naira," he whispered, his voice a rough fracture of the man the world feared. "My world, it's a cage. Tell me to walk away before I ruin you too." Naira didn't move. Her white t-shirt was soaked, clinging to her skin like a shroud, but her eyes remained wide, fixed on him, the anchor in his storm. Her hand was flat and steady over his heart, feeling the frantic, guilty thud of a man who had finally been cornered by his own ghost. But as she leaned into him, the cold, lethal weight of the silver handgun tucked into his waistband pressed against her hip, a reminder of the violence he claimed he wanted to leave behind. The SUV that followed me, Biam Suk, Naira said, her voice a calm, low melody that sliced through the sound of the falling water. The photos on my doorstep. The threats at the rooftop. You told me it was your enemies. You told me you were protecting me from the darkness of the syndicate. Biam Suk's breath hitched. He didn't open his eyes, but his grip on her waist tightened, a desperate, possessive clawing. I waited for you to tell me the truth, she continued, her gaze unblinking. But I realized something when I saw the footage from the lounge. The men in that SUV, they weren't Park's men. They were yours. The silence that followed was heavier than the water. The pained surrender she had seen in him wasn't the exhaustion of a victim. It was the shame of a craftsman. He hadn't been protecting her from a monster. He had been the monster, orchestrating a theater of terror to see if she would break like the 17 women before her. He had manufactured the very danger he used to bind her to him. Naira looked at the silver handgun, the tool of his trade, and then back to the man who claimed to love her. In the blue-toned light, she finally understood the manhood that had scared the others away. It wasn't his intensity or his history. It was the fact that his fear of being unlovable had made him a man who would set the world on fire just to see if she would stay in the flames. The heavy click of the door was a finality that the loudest gunshot could never achieve. In the luxury suite, the blue-tinted steam began to evaporate, leaving behind only the cold, sterile smell of expensive marble and the damp weight of clothes that would never quite dry. Biam Suk stood in the center of the room, his head still bowed, but there was no one left to lean against. He reached for the silver handgun at his waistband and set it on the vanity. It looked smaller now, a heavy, useless piece of metal that had failed to protect him from the one thing he actually feared, himself. He had spent his life building a fortress of violence and paranoia, convinced that his manhood was a weapon that made him untouchable. He had manufactured a storm to see if Naira would weather it, never realizing that by doing so, he had become the very wreckage he promised she would never be. He was changed. The monster that had fueled his rise in the syndicate felt hollow, drained by the realization that he had finally found a woman who didn't run, only to give her every reason to walk away. Naira hadn't broken against his intensity. She had simply seen through the mask of the boss and found a man too terrified to be loved. She hadn't left because she was afraid of his world. She had left because she was the only one who truly understood it. As the sun began to bleed a pale, watery light over the Seoul skyline, Biam Suk looked at his reflection in the mirror. His skin was still marked by the intricate black ink of his history, but the man beneath the tattoos felt like a ghost. He had achieved the peace he sought. The rivals were subdued, the syndicate was stable, and the silence in his home was absolute. But as he looked at the empty space where Naira had stood, the only person brave enough to look him in the eye and see a human, he finally understood the true price of his crown. The 17 women before her had fled from the shadow of the boss. But Naira, the 18th, had stayed long enough to see the man, and that was the greatest casualty of all. Biam Suk was finally an anchor, but he was resting at the bottom of an ocean of his own making, alone in the blue-toned dark.